Now, as a sound designer, I'm constantly looking out for new ideas and techniques, but over the last few months, I have been getting much better at that. And that's what I want to talk about today. Now, first of all, what I want to do with this video is I want to give you a clear understanding of my workflow when it comes to actually trying to learn and develop new techniques for myself in terms of the sound design, but also to a certain extent in mixing and mastering or arrangement and whatnot. Over the last couple of months, I've been experimenting with just these more talkative videos where I get to edit a little bit more, and I also just get to talk about the subject without necessarily having to show you stuff in the DAW. And most of these videos are on the process of just learning things. And of course, when it comes to music production, there's plenty of stuff that you need to learn. So I think that's an important part of the conversation when it comes about creating tutorials for music production. And as I said, today I want to focus a little bit more on how I've been experimenting myself with using different sound design techniques that I've just newly discovered. And really in the last 2 months, the process that I've been using to force myself to be a little bit more creative. So this is one of the projects where this has resulted in some really cool sounds. So stuff like this. You can hear all kinds of crazy mangling of sounds, all kinds of crazy sounds kind of shifting in and out in different ways. And all of that is, of course, things that I've been experimenting with that I wasn't able to do before. Now I can go in here and I can go and talk about each individual sound that I've created here and each individual process that I've used. I cannot go too much in detail because a lot of this stuff is frozen. So as you can see, these are mostly just audio samples. And really when it comes to this learning process, there isn't really a way that I can explain everything that I'm doing so that you can learn it. Because a lot of the stuff that I'm doing is of course deliberate to this particular project. I can say something like, if you want this sound, you can use this synth and you can use these settings and then you get this sound. But maybe you want a slightly different sound. Like let's say that you're following the tutorial for a riser that is 16 bars long, but your track needs an 8-bar riser. At that point, your success of creating that riser isn't really based on the tutorial anymore. It's going to be based on your ability to adapt to what the tutorial is doing and convert that from a 16-bar idea to an 8-bar idea. Or of course, taking inspiration from that tutorial and doing then something similar that just works for 8 bars. And that is going to be true with all of these sounds. Here I have this really cool sound that I'm really proud of, which is just this kind of organy sound. And you can hear it's glitched up and kind of processed in all kinds of different ways. So there's a lot of crazy stuff that I could dive into, that I could explain, but that doesn't really explain to you the process with which I came up with this idea. By the way, if you do want to see that, I do believe that for this section that I wrote, there's a live stream available that basically goes over everything, but it's a no mic and no cam stream, so it's just going to be the DAW. And I think it's quite long. I believe I streamed for like 7 hours. I don't remember. And during that stream, we worked a lot on this segment over here and also worked on some of the intro synths over here. We worked on some other parts later on in this drop here. So that is a much better resource if you just want to see me actually develop these kind of ideas. What I mainly want to talk about is kind of the framework behind it. And the very first thing is actually going to be that stream. One of the things that streaming does for you, even if it's a no-cam stream, is that it forces you to take your full attention on the thing that you're doing because you are broadcasting it to somebody else. You don't want them to get bored. So if you have a 7-hour live stream, especially if you're not too focused on the chat, and especially if you're doing like what I do, which is no mic and no cam, I switch around from time to time. Sometimes I like to produce with camera and microphone and just have a chat with people. And sometimes I like to focus a little bit more and actually use the fact that I'm live as an advantage to make sure that I don't get distracted from trying to entertain the people that are watching me. Because what tends to be the case is that these kind of experimentations really come from just undivided attention. And I guess the effect that is at play here is that you get into a flow of production once you start working on a track. It's much harder to get into a track and to really feel a track if every, I don't know, half an hour you walk away or you grab your phone or you check some messages or do whatever else. Then it's going to be much harder to stay in that moment of focus where you're inspired to create something new that you have never tried before and to actually make that work. The second thing that I've noticed is that it's all about tools, and this is going to be the exact opposite way of what you're probably thinking right now. And what you're probably thinking is that you need to buy all of these cool plugins that you can get to experiment with, but it's really the other way around. Don't get me wrong, I have a lot of plugins. If I just go through my menu, you can see I have a lot of different synths. I had a lot of different reverbs. I have a lot of different delays. I have a lot of different saturations. I have a lot of different distortions. From all of these plugins, from every one of these lists, I probably use maybe here, I would say the top 5, maybe 6. And then of course, for a kick drum, I have a different plugin and some other stuff that is like very specific. For the reverb, I only use M-Turbo Reverb like 99% of the time, I would say. Delays is mainly Echo Boy Jr. and just the normal echo over here. And there's a very good philosophy behind that. And that is that I've noticed that having like a daily driver plugin that is really good at just doing one thing, say for my sound design, it is going to be Serum. For my delay, it's going to be Echo Boy Jr. probably. For my reverb, it's obviously M-Turbo Reverb. That is the only reverb that I ever use. So I get these kind of daily driver plugins that I can really dig into and that I really can start to understand how they sound. I can kind of make a judgment before I even load up the plugin if I'm going to find the setting in it or not. And if I get to that not point, then I can go and I can experiment with all of the other plugins that I have. Now, some beginning producers may look at this list and say, okay, that means that I need to find a whole bunch of different delays that I can use. Well, that's not really the case. At the end of the day, you can make this list as small as you want. It's going to limit your options a little bit, but your main delay, the one that you're using like all the time, like your equivalent of my Echo Boy Jr., that is going to be the plugin that you can afford to spend a little bit of money on because that is, of course, a daily driver. But if we go through this whole list here, I would say that maybe more than half of this is free. And a lot of the other stuff, for example, all of the Melder stuff, is stuff that I gotten with a bundle. Yes, I did pay for that bundle, but I didn't necessarily buy that bundle specifically for the delay. So a lot of the plugins in here are just kind of like afterthought plugins. I've just installed them. I've added them to this list so that I can pull them up if I want to experiment a little bit, but I basically never use them. So when it actually comes to the plugins, I don't want to encourage people too much to become a plugin hoarder. What I want you to do is I want you to very specifically state like, okay, this plugin is going to be my daily driver, or maybe these 2 plugins. If you have like 2 different sounds that you like, then you can use a few more plugins. That doesn't really matter if it's just like one specific plugin. Even a plugin like M-Turbo Reverb, if I open up the M-Turbo Reverb inside of it, it has like 100 different algorithms in here. So it's not like this is one reverb, it's multiple reverbs just packaged into one. The whole idea is not going to be about, okay, how many plugins do I have? Do I have enough plugins to have this kind of workflow? You just need to identify a few processes that you know work, and then a few processes where you can experiment. And this is important because when it comes to writing music, I find myself mainly in the later stages of a production falling a little bit back on the things that I already know work. And one of the reasons for that is because it is often nice to have kind of some common themes within your sound design. And if you use one process in one part of the track and you use that in another part of the track, it's probably going to sound very similar to that other part of the track. And that means you can breed some cohesion between the elements of the track, which usually just makes the track sound nicer. But it also improves your workflow a little bit. You can imagine it like, okay, you start off the track and you get a whole bunch of new ideas. And after a while, you're probably going to get bored of like the actual creation of the ideas. What tends to happen is people get to, say, this part of the track and they're like, oh, I want to create a new kick and bass. They drop this production, they move on to the next production, and then they work on that for a while. But the fun part is that all of the tools that I would need to have to finish this production, to do all of the other sound design, are already kind of captured in the sound design that I've done up until this point. I know what the theme is going to be. I know what the feeling of the sound is going to be. I know what all of the sequences are doing in this part. So the sequences are probably going to do a similar thing in this part over here. You can imagine that once you have an idea of a track, it becomes much easier to implement the rest of the track because you kind of already know what you're going to do. Now, another thing that I want to talk about is the idea that you can get lost in experimentation. You can experiment to the point where anything that you get out of it is basically unusable, in the sense that you can maybe overprocess something, but also in the sense that you experiment so much with a certain sound design technique that you get bored of it, and therefore you don't like the sounds that you're getting out of it anymore. This is actually something that happens every once in a while with my tone spec, which is a product that I sell over on my Gumroad. And all that the tone spec is just a whole big collection of individual cycles. So the wavetable position over here does nothing. It is just a whole bunch of different individual tones. That is, of course, why it's called the tone spec. And the cool thing about it is that you can just play it, and you immediately get a nice gritty sound that can be a starting portion. can hear a whole bunch of different timbres, a whole bunch of different ideas out of that. And while this is a nice starting point, if you start every sound with a tones from the tones pack, which by the way is one of the most used products that I use because I like this starting point so much, at some point you do get a little bit bored of it. And I found myself doing this as well, where I get a little bit bored of just the same tones pack sound over and over again. I kind of know what vibe of sound I'm going to get if I start a sound design session with the tones from my tones pack. So you can imagine that for my usage with this pack, there's kind of like a cycle where I go through where sometimes I really like using it and sometimes I really don't like using it. And you kind of get this continuous back and forth of me sometimes using it a lot, sometimes you're not using it at all, and kind of creating all of my tones from scratch. And there's this really cool interaction with that in the sense that when it comes to how I work with me having like 10 active projects at any given time, that means that for almost every project, almost every version of me is going to work on that project. So there's going to be a version of me that really likes using this particular technique. There's going to be a version of me that really doesn't like this particular technique. So I'm going to get a nice wide variety of sounds out of that. You can kind of imagine that every version of projector kind of works on a project. From time to time, it's one projector. From time to time, it's another projector. And they just have slightly different flavors of what sound design they like and what ideas they like. Now, this last bit kind of circles back to the thing that I said earlier, where at the start of a project or at the start of a session, generally speaking, you tend to be very creative. You tend to exactly know what you kind of want to do in terms of the experimentation that you want to do. Usually what happens for me is that I've listened to the track before I start working on it. If I have a big session, I usually prepare like a big list of things that I want to do. So usually at the start with your experimentation, you have all of these creative ideas. And then throughout the session, if you're working more and more and more on the track, maybe even throughout multiple sessions, if you're doing sessions like daily on a track, what tends to happen is that you're kind of drifting off into doing less and less experimentation and more focusing on actually trying to get the ideas that you have experimented with and fitting them in a track and making sure that they actually just work from a technical standpoint, but also that they just aesthetically work. And that tends to be a process that revolves much less about stuff that you don't know. When it comes to experimentation, one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that you're doing stuff where you don't exactly know the end result. When it comes to my track writing, at some point, I need to finish the track. So I need to actually make everything work. And you cannot really make things work if you don't know what you're doing, right? So you need to know what you're doing. So you get to a point where you're mainly working on techniques and just things that you already know in order to finalize the actual idea, in order to make sure that the idea actually works and that it's just a full-fledged track that you can bring out. And actually accepting that this is the case is one of the important parts for me of actually finishing tracks. Realizing the fact that, okay, at this point in the track, I can start to implement a new idea. I can start to implement a new sound into this track that will take me, say, an hour of experimentation. Or I can use this other route, which I know works, which I know also is going to get me a sound that when the people will hear it, when they're listening to the track, they'll still enjoy. But it's a little bit easier for me to make. I'll usually towards the end of a production, I'll go with the easier route. And usually at the start of production, I tend to go with the more experimental route. So that's going to be it. That is everything that I want to talk about today. If you like these more talkative videos and you like these subjects, make sure that you're subscribed. And if you want to recommend some subjects that you want me to cover, make sure that you leave a comment down below. Another way to support the channel is financially, which is why my Patreon page is available in the end cards. So if you do choose to support me, thank you very much. But in general, thank you for watching and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.